let's jump in and talk about this next things that you can see on the screen right now called security standards. Now, many of us typically will probably fall into maybe one of these or maybe two of these in our careers. It's very rare that I see people that have experience in all of these. And I think that, what's interesting is if you look at what drives the security standards and figure out, how it aligns with your organization, then, typically from an enterprise architecture perspective, you can strategically align and really enable your business for security effectiveness by figuring out how you're going to be audited, but more importantly, how you can practice due care, like finding the issues within the network or within the system or within the software, and then detecting it, practicing due diligence, but then correcting it as well. And so what is the driver within our organization for security standards? Sometimes it's federal law, like with Sarbanes-Oxley or Graham-Leach-Bliley. You may have heard of some of those before. If not, we'll talk about those a little bit later. But is it administrative or regulatory, where you're looking to federal or government agencies to give you meaning to help govern that? Is it international standards? This is an international test, so some of the questions may have international standards on there. What about like industrial standards and specific to your field? Like if you're doing things with FPGAs, field programmable gate arrays for SCADA systems, let's say, do you have a way that you could figure out what the standard is for that? And if not, is there something close to it? Or, you can be very specific with that. Sometimes from a high level here, I think about what is something that many of you may be familiar with, and that would be the NIST standards. But the NIST standards show us and really guide us for ways that we can do implementation of various things. One of the things that we typically look at whenever we're doing the implementation of any applying a framework, if you will, to any type of security lockdown of the system, usually we'll start with the NIST cybersecurity framework, the CISSP. If we need to get a little bit more granular, we'll go with the NIST 800-171. And if we want to be super detail oriented and we want it to take forever, then we'll do the NIST 853. And whatever revision you're on, it doesn't matter, right? It's just putting different lipstick on the pig. But essentially, these are ways that we can, recommended ways that give us really a general approach that help us by advising us and giving us some flexibility. I've always looked at, I think, when I was younger, I was more of a, why are we doing this? And then, what I figured out in supporting DoD and federal things is that if you don't bake security into the solution, and we'll talk about the product lifecycle later on and systems engineering lifecycle and software engineering lifecycle. If you don't bake it in to the entire process as you're going through that, it's 10 times more costly to bolt on the solution at the tail end of the product or the project. And because of that, we have these different organizations that allow us to interact with them to get guidance. You may be familiar with some of these, and if not, that's fine, because we're about to jump into these right now. So let's take a second to get a little bit more familiar. Yeah, so many of you probably are familiar with NIST, and if at a super high level you've never seen it before, let me just show you something real quick. So this is an open source tool that is developed and maintained. Yeah, so for just conversational purposes here, check this out. So if we have all these different assessments that we want to go and do, each one of these standards allows you to do an implementation that is meaningful based off of whatever you're into. And so if you're accepting credit card transactions on your website, you would need to adhere to the payment card industry data security standard. And so if you've looked at that at all, somebody mentioned before, many of the controls and guidance from the Federal Information Processing, whatever S stands for, 140, and even more granular with the -2 for cryptographic transactions, it's likely there would be quite a bit of overlap between something like this and the PCI DSS. I say that because in addition, so if you were to do an assessment on the NIST cybersecurity framework at one time, and then you did it on the 800-171, this is going to be probably about 50 questions that you have to answer. This one's 110 questions that you have to answer. This one, my goodness, I think it's like 480 plus. And so if you actually did that, like if you used a tool like this CSET tool to be able to do that assessment, and then let's say that you were needing to do a PCI DSS assessment at some point, if you started for some reason having transactions that took credit card information, between one of these and the other, there's going to be at least 50 to 60% of the same information that's already been done between these assessments. And what's kind of neat here is typically what we'll do if we're doing multiple ways to do an assessment and applying these different types of standards, we would create this thing that's called a crosswalk document. So in software, it's more for managing data. And so, typically what we see is, like for the federal government, there's like an IDA or an ICD. You may have heard of those, like an interface definition agreement or a interface control document that basically it's almost like an API, an application programming interface. And so the crosswalk will tell you that, hey, the NIST 800-171, the family of controls that they call quote unquote access control, if you were doing a PCI DSS, they may call that access only. So yeah, the crosswalk would essentially say that it's a little bit more granular than that, but it would be like, let me just show you here. So let's say that in the NIST 800-171 AC access control family, the control 1.1.1 would be equal to PCI 1.1.2, something like that. And so you would have that crosswalk document that shows you that, hey, we already did the assessment for NIST, and here were the findings that we got for NIST, and because of that, we don't have to do basically we don't repeat and repeat, right? We can have object reuse between the two frameworks that we're using, so we don't have to do a lot of work. Because just like if you've already taken Security Plus, or you have a master's degree in cybersecurity, or you have an undergraduate degree in cybersecurity, or you've taken a bunch of SANS courses, there's only so many ways that I can cut this tomato before we start seeing the overlap. And that's the same thing here. It's, you know, if you're dealing with this stuff, you're going to see it called things that are subtly different, but it's basically the same. The last thing here that I want to talk about is this OWASP. And so anybody who's done any application development before might have heard of the Open Web Application Security Project, or OWASP. And so what OWASP does typically is they publish this thing that they call the OWASP Top 10. And the OWASP Top 10, you can go and look it up. It shows you what are the top 10 vulnerabilities for specific type of web applications. And, you know, so these are just some resources to standardize ways that we can implement security. And typically there's overlap if you've already done one to another one. And I think that that's the key takeaway here. So at a super high level, hopefully that makes sense. And if not, then let me know. I can try to explain it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one of these, but NERC, you can read here, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, critical infrastructure. So that's a way, standardized way that critical infrastructure can adhere to security. NIST, we already talked about that. There's these things called the NVDs, and you guys are probably familiar with MITRE as well. MITRE publishes those, something that's similar to those, which is the CVEs, the Common Vulnerability and Enumerations. If you're familiar with that, you probably know that really each Tuesday they come up with each and every one of these. All right, so I would definitely know these at a super high level. Only 5 to 7 words about each of these will suffice. So what does that mean? To me, that means that if you see an acronym that you either have known at one point and you've slept since then, or you're refreshing yourself and you just didn't remember what it was, you may not need to write that one down. But if this is the first time that you're seeing something like, for instance, the NVD, me as somebody who hates to fail, I would make a note card or write it down to make sure that, hey, I need to go back and review this a little bit. But you don't need to actually program or implement. You don't need to know it at an expert level. It's just enough to be dangerous. Remember, 10 miles wide and an inch deep on these terms. So if you see the acronym NVD show up on the exam, that you know that that's the National Vulnerability Database. Because sometimes they spell it out, most of the time they just use acronyms. And when we get into the communications and network security, there's a hella acronyms. And so, I would either make your own note cards, cut up pieces of paper and make them, or you go up to Publix or wherever shopping is a pleasure and buy 200 or 300 of those for $3. That'll be the best $3 that you've ever invested, especially for this exam if you want to pass it. This is one that we don't really see that much come up, but apparently there's one that's called the International Society of Automation, ISA. I've personally never used it before, but I have read a little bit about it. And just like I was saying, the certification, the quote unquote certification for these is very similar to a lot of the different controls that we see put in place, but it's more for automation. You can go and read about this on your own accord. Definitely know this, 100% chance that you will see this one on the exam. Did you know, and this part that I'm telling you will not be on the exam, that in order for you to be a managed security services provider that does PCI DSS assessments, I believe it's like 10 grand a year to be a provider, an official third-party provider for PCI DSS. So if you're coming in and doing like a gap analysis of where somebody is in their PCI DSS compliant journey, Just to come in as a trusted third party, it's 10 grand a year to play. OWASP, somebody that took it 2 weeks ago said that they had one question on OWASP on their exam. So know that at a high level.